Like I said, KJ is usually rock solid with this. My man, KJ. No, how you doing, KJ? You doing okay today?
I'm doing well. Good to be with you.
It's always good to have you, KJ. You're a fan audience favorite. We have a really good crowd today. KJ Noah is a journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia Pacific region. He was contributor to a book, Capitalism on a Ventilator. Once censored by Amazon, it is now available at iacenter.org. KJ, you are also on a show. What is that show named?
It is called The China Report on the Breakthrough News Network on YouTube.
Fantastic. Check him out. Everything he says is brilliant. I don't want to put you on a pedestal, but I've had some really good conversations with you that I've deeply enjoyed over the years. So thank you, KJ.
Thank you.
Um, China, Wang Li is in Russia right now. What is this conversation that is taking place between the Russians and the Chinese, especially considering it is Liberation Day in America, which is effectively Trump putting tariffs on the entire world? That's supposed to take place at 4 p.m. So that's supposed to take place later today. What is the conversation between Wang Yi and I would imagine Sergei Lavrov and the Kremlin?
Well, the discussion is a message. The fact that they're coming together is sending a very, very strong message that the attempt to separate China and Russia is not going to work. If you recall, after Trump was elected, there was a lot of talk about pulling off a reverse Kissinger. That is to say, separating Russia from China to prevent this, strong relationship they had. And this is a direct refutation of this. This is to point out that China and Russia are inseparable in their in their alliance with each other, and that the U.S. will not be able to, simply peel off and then divide and conquer, as seems to be the plan.
And by the way, apparently Xi Jinping is going to be at the Victory Day celebrations that are going to take place along with other world leaders. There was a thought that Trump may show up, but it doesn't seem that Trump is going to be on the guest list for that. But I do think it's a big deal that Xi Jinping is the honored guest that is going to be at that celebration. Trump is threatening secondary sanctions after the regular. Oh, before I get to that, this story. So apparently, South Korea, Japan, and China are coming together in order to rebuff the sanctions that Trump is about to put on. Now, that is fascinating because these countries have very complicated histories with one another for them to be coming together. As we pointed out once before, South Korea, Japan had comfort women, that slaves from South Korea invaded China. They were at war in the Second World War. So they don't necessarily have the coziest of relationships, and yet we're willing to come together to effectively say, we are not going to accept these sanctions. That's amazing to me. What is the go, please?
No, I mean, I think we have to wait a little bit further to see what the actual content of that coordination looks like. But it is pretty extraordinary, and it seems like Trump is driving his quote unquote allies into the arms of his quote unquote enemies. China, Korea, Japan coordinating together. That is extraordinary. I am still a little bit cautious about making any grand pronouncements about that, because I think there is so much, as you point out, bad blood and also deliberate division and separation that the U.S. has instigated over the years. So I'm still holding my breath, if you will. But just the mere declaration of that is quite extraordinary. It is really, the world is shifting in deep, profound, and unpredictable ways.
That is true. And yeah, that is true. I was looking at this thing for Vance. I'm sorry. Trump seems to be sick of Ukraine. He seems to be trying to pivot China. Look, we're going to get to South Korea in a bit, but I do want to get to this thing of China. There seems to be an Asian pivot that seems to be taking place, or at the very least that they want to take place, or they want to move into. Let me phrase it this way. When in the New York Times, when they came out with their article affirming things that we have been talking about effectively, saying the United States have been supplying intelligence, picking targets, supplying weapons, materials, etc. And the scale and the scope of the materials that we were supplying and the effectiveness of that intelligence has been astonishing. It means that it was the US that was effectively fighting a war with Russia using Ukrainian soldiers just as pieces to move around on the board. Now, they do come up with this thing of if Ukraine would have just listened to us, we would have totally won this conflict, which completely ignores the fact that Russia beat the hell out of NATO forces in this area, right? Um, but what that also means is that they were able to have a low level, or let's say a conflict, where like a million people died, with Russia not acknowledging that the US was effectively the main backer of it. And by not acknowledging it, not having to get into a direct conflict with the United States, which means they could avoid nuclear weapons coming into play, even though there were threats about nuclear weapons being called into play. Is it possible that they are trying to do something similar with China? This belief that, well, we were able to have a proxy, quote unquote, war in Ukraine with Russia without them really acknowledging because they didn't necessarily want to go to nuclear war. And we can have something similar with China. Now, China has been doing military exercises recently where they surrounded Taiwan Island almost as a show of force, once again, that they could do so. Why are they doing this now? And are they doing this now in response to something that Trump administration is doing?
Um, yes, and it's also related to what the Taiwan DPP ruling government is doing. If you recall, a few weeks ago, the DPP ruler, William Lai, he's essentially Washington's man in Taiwan, on Taiwan Island. The DPP is the US Quisling party. And he recently declared 17 measures that were going to essentially prevent any possibility of peaceful reunification with China. He, inside those 17 provisions, was a plan to bring back military tribunals, something that they have not had since 2013. So it's similar to Yoon Suk-yeol's martial law declaration. Well, not exactly the same, but it has the same flavor, and this kind of open, brazen assertion of secession. Remember, Taiwan is part of China. This is recognized by the UN, by the United States, by Taiwan's own constitution, and by all the countries in the world. There is no country that recognizes, two Chinas, or one Taiwan and one China. There is only one China. Everybody agrees that Taiwan is part of China, and the vast majority of countries in the world, including the US, including the UN, agree that China is the legitimate government of this one China. And so Lai Ching-te is saying that, essentially declaring a kind of de facto secession, and that is unacceptable. That crosses a line for the Chinese, and so they're trying to send a message to him. But we have to understand this in the light of the recent revelations, which you pointed out, that Washington was waging war against Russia. I mean, this was literally Washington fighting Russia directly. They were, directing the plans. They were targeting. They were on the ground. Telling and selecting targets, telling them who to hit. And when they say, "Oh, we lost because the Ukrainians, wouldn't let us do what we wanted to do," I mean, that is absurd. I mean, come on, let's be real here. This is the excuse that always comes out. When Washington loses a war, they always come out with this standard mantra: we lost because somebody tied our hands behind our backs, right? I mean, this is what Scott Ritter says about a potential war, any war. He always says this, but it's been a mantra since the Vietnam War. Somebody tied our hands behind our backs. Otherwise, we would have, demolished them in 2 seconds. So, same mantra, same propaganda. But once again, I think we need to understand this is, the U.S. direct involvement in war against the Russians signals that the US is probably preparing exactly the same scenario for Taiwan. And we know that there are US troops on the ground on Taiwan Island, on Jinmen Island, which is part of the archipelago, that is 4 kilometers away from the Chinese mainland. They're Green Beret on there right now. It would be like, PLA troops on Key West or something like that. That's intolerable. And then we have seen that Pete Hegseth had a memo. It's just recently leaked by the Washington Post, but it's the secret memo which says that the U.S. is preparing to wage war with China over Taiwan. And essentially, it's saying that, there is only one war that we are focusing on, and that is war with China. This is the secret memo distributed in mid-March by Pete Hegseth to the entire DoD. There is one war we're preparing for, that is war with China over Taiwan. And then they go over the specific, things that they're going to, they're actively preparing for war. The war is war with China over Taiwan. The war requires pre-positioning, prioritization, the third offset, dispersion, distribution, diffusion of long-range standoff weapons, subsurface weapons, automated platforms, and then the Ukrainized porcupining of Taiwan with asymmetrical weapons. So these recent revelations from the Washington Post, the recent moves towards secession, the State Department's removal of its fact sheet that opposes Taiwan secession, the intensive arming and training of Taiwan as a proxy, including the delivery of Block 70 F-16s. This is the most up-to-date F-16s. The Japanese government is currently drafting plans to remove civilians from the Okinawan Islands near Taiwan. That means the Japanese government is preparing for those islands to be used in war. And then there are heightened war preparations throughout the entire region, including South Korea. That's why they recently had that bombing of, civilians, 152 houses destroyed, because they're doing live fire exercises that are approaching the intensity and tempo of actual war. And we know that in actual war, between 5 and 25% of people killed are actually, friendly fire incidents. And then the most important thing to understand is that Taiwan has always been a threat to China. It has never been independent. And any notion of quote unquote Taiwan secession or independence just means that it's going more and more deeply into the US orbit as a US fire base, as a US forward base, as an unsinkable firecraft carrier. But remember, if the US wages war against China, Taiwan is the key force projection platform. It is the staging area for waging war. And we know that the US had concrete plans, it's out in the public, to nuke China. In 1950 to 1953, they were planning to nuke China from Taiwan. In 1956, this is a single SAC plan. 1958, 1962 to 1964, single integrated operational plans. All of these were plans to nuke China using Taiwan as the base to launch these attacks. So because of that kind of strategic threat that Taiwan Island poses to China, China is sending a strong signal to Taiwan that they should not get any ideas. And if there are any ideas, that China can very rapidly encircle Taiwan and blockade it. So that's the messaging that's going on right now.
Wow. The succession plans that are effectively going through in regards to legislation, does it have popular support?
No, not at all. Not at all. the vast majority of over 80% of the people on Taiwan Island want to keep the status quo. And I think there's only probably about 5% of hardcore pro-Japanese, and they're very pro-Japanese. The William Lai administration is actually a pro-Japanese government. They say that Japan is the motherland, if you can believe it. Japan, which colonized Taiwan, for over half a century. They say that Japan is the motherland. They've been revising the textbooks, telling people, that the liberator of Taiwan was half Japanese, etc. So, but they're pro-Japanese and pro-US. They're actually US quislings. Their vice president was a US citizen, a Jersey girl, until very recently. And so this is the geopolitical chessboard.
I was laughing at the Jersey girl. I think that just sounds funny.
Oh, she grew up in New Jersey, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Did she?
Yes.
How do they orient themselves? This puts me in mind of like these Nazi Russians. It's like, okay, how does that work? I don't know how that works. How do you politically shape yourself into being that way? It sounds like that. Like, how do they wrap themselves into this notion that Japanese, South Koreans, like that these things are one to one, as you pointed out, slavery, comfort women, and how does this get any level of political support in the country?
Well, you do it. You start it with the kids, and you take the textbooks and you revise them. And they've been doing this for several decades now. And so, for example, they're no longer teaching Chinese history as part of, national history. That's a separate subject. And Taiwan has its own history, blah, blah, blah. We are, separate. And then, the liberator of Taiwan was a Portuguese colony. The Portuguese used it as a slave colony. There was a Chinese loyalist with the Ming Dynasty who fought off the Portuguese and liberated it. And he's revered as kind of the founder or literally a demigod in Taiwan. If you go there, you'll see temples worshiping him. But his mother was Japanese. And so they're claiming that, look, he was Japanese, his mother was Japanese, Japan is the motherland. And the important thing to understand is that Taiwan was colonized by Japan from 1895. The Japanese stole it from China as war booty as a result of the Sino-Japanese War. That was the war spoils that they demanded from China, along with the Liaodong Peninsula. But the Liaodong Peninsula was returned to China, but Taiwan was never returned because the US took it over as a forward base to fight the Chinese communists. But during this long period of colonization, as is normal, there was a group of Japanese collaborators. There were Taiwanese who collaborated with the Japanese government. And the current Lai Ching-te government is a continuation of this collaborator class. And so that's why they consider, quote unquote, Japan to be the motherland. One of the first elected, presidents of Taiwan Island was actually part Japanese. And he would, put on a samurai outfit and, do the tea ritual and all of that. It was insane. But it's a little bit like, the Nazis in Ukraine or in Europe. They still have this, longing and desire to connect themselves to this, vicious military force that they see as, the kind of animating spirit of the region and of their quote unquote, politics. So it's ugly, it's disgusting. We have the same problem in Korea. Japanese collaborators who were never purged, and they still hold power in the government. And Yoon Suk-yeol is one of them.
How serious do you think the Trump administration is about this pivot? Meaning, it's one thing to say, okay, we want to get to the Asia Pacific region. Fair enough. Obama wanted to do something very similar. They believe that China was an issue because, from America's point of view, we don't want to lose our economic hegemony or military hegemony. And from their mind, China has a massive industrial base. And because they have a massive industrial base, this can also lead to a massive military, in which case we do not want to take a backseat to China. That's kind of the way they seem to frame it. Either we rule the world or we all go up in flames. But as you pointed out once before, some of these people believe that they can win a nuclear war if indeed a nuclear war comes out of it. I get the sense that they think that they may be able to have a low level conflict if indeed they need to have a low level conflict without it spiraling into some kind of nuclear oblivion. I think they're out of their minds, but they have to come up with justifications for this kind of pivot and this kind of military force that they're building up around China as this threatening fashion. How does Xi Jinping deal with this? How is he viewing this? I know he has allies like Russia, and like you said, they're closer than allies. And I would imagine in any military conflict, it's not going to be just against China. It will probably be against China and Russia. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. But how does Xi Jinping maneuver this in order to avoid a war while not necessarily losing any kind of military positioning in any kind of negotiations or anything that he does regarding policy?
You know, I think that their approach is that we are going to simply connect to the rest of the world and use our relationships with the rest of the world through the BRI, through the, BRICS, to build goodwill and show that another world is possible. And hopefully over the long term, the US will get the message. So it's similar to what actually Chairman Mao did during the Civil War, which he referred to as encircling the cities from the countryside. Simply, send in the PLA or the 8th Route, the 4th Route Army and build relationships with everybody. It's that, thing from Go. In chess, you occupy, you position in order to kill. In Go, you connect in order to live, right? That's what China is doing. It's connecting the world, it's connecting the global south in order to live. So I think that's China's larger strategy. But why does the US believe that it can win a war against China when it has never won a war with a peer competitor, certainly not with Russia, which they didn't even consider to be a peer. It was, gas station, right? And remember, the United States has already fought China in 1950. 1950 to 1953 was a war between, the Korean War between the US and China. There were 3 million Chinese troops that went and fought against the Americans during the Korean War. Chairman Mao sent his own son to fight, and his son was buried in North Korea. So the war between the U.S. has already been, that test has already been conducted. And China was one of the poorest countries on the planet at the time. They were sending in troops into battle with, without guns. Only 1 out of 3 troops actually had guns. They were going in with mismatched sneakers. They didn't have coats when they were fighting in the in the winter in Korea. Let me assure you, it's really, really cold, and they still beat the United States, to a standstill. This was when the U.S. was the most powerful country on the planet, and the Chinese were probably the weakest, least developed, poorest country on the planet, and they still beat the United States on the Korean Peninsula. So this is a war that the U.S. cannot win because China is multiples. It's, thousands of times more powerful than when it fought in 1950. But there are 2 things. One is, first there's ideology. I think the U.S. is so trapped in its notion that it is superior and that it has to dominate the world, that it cannot brook the idea that it is going to have a Asian or non-white, non-Western, country that has significant weight or heft in the global system. It cannot tolerate that. And I have said this before, I'll say it again. It gives me no pleasure to say this, but I believe that the US is planning to use nukes. I think that they will start with tactical nukes. Everything, I think all of their calculations show that they are, that nukes are part of this war plan, that it's a seamless continuum between conventional and nuclear warfare, certainly tactical nukes or non-strategic nukes. So I believe that that's the case. And there's no guarantee that once you cross that threshold, that will stay, non-tactical, that it could very easily go over into strategic nuclear warfare. And so I see that, it's the US ruling class that they would rather see the end of the planet than the end of their power and privilege.
Because just to be clear, that would be the end of the planet. Because you're right. A tactical nuke is a nuke, and the people will respond in kind.
Absolutely. I mean, there's probably a sector of the defense industry that believes that they can beat China simply by, great strategy and by dispersion, the third offset, automated warfare, drones, automated, battle platforms. But, these are like the people. If you look at the polls, there are 6% of sentient adults in the United States who believe that they can beat a grizzly bear in hand-to-hand combat. I kid you not. You can look up the statistics. They even have like diagrams of how to, beat a grizzly bear. Now, a grizzly bear is like, it's like
huge. Yeah.
I mean, it's like 5 to 9 times the weight of Mike Tyson, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, at 1,700 pounds. They have specimens that weigh 1,700 pounds, and yet 6% of adults in the United States believe that they can beat a grizzly bear in hand-to-hand combat. I think this is, the same affliction that may be affecting some of the, the leaders, the war planners, in the United States.
Yeah, I think racism takes people into weird places. And I think the same logic where they say, well, if the Ukrainians just would have listened to us, we didn't really lose it. It was, the Russians couldn't really beat us. They're backwards and they're this and they're that. It's the same logic that Hitler had, right? The moment that we go in, it'll fall over, we just kick it and it'll just collapse in on itself. Missing the fact that, no, other people are sophisticated. Other people are competent. Other people do have capability. And I think, and in China, it's ironic because in one sense, you would have J.D. Vance that would go out and make the speech saying, well, hey, these other countries around the world have gotten far more sophisticated in the capability of what they can build and what they can ship. And so we need to rechange. Well, he's talking about China, right? He's specifically talking about China. These guys are putting out flying cars, moon missions. Like, this is not racism leads you astray in regards to your appraisal of your adversary or your enemy. And in China's case, don't really need to be an enemy. It's just we need to maintain a certain amount of hegemonic control. And that control is leading us into conflict. Like the moment that you run into somebody who doesn't want to be controlled, okay, now we have conflict. And it's that in the way that we're dealing with the world, whether it's in Ukraine or whether it's with Taiwan. You would agree with me, though, Taiwan is a red line, meaning regardless of building relationships and everything else, if the U.S. works with Taiwan in order to declare independence, all hell breaks loose, or doesn't.
Absolutely. It's Taiwan is a pawn on the 8th row of the chessboard. It is a piece, and it will be sacrificed. And that's what, their leaders don't seem to understand, or maybe they don't care. It will be a sacrifice, but it is such a powerful piece that China cannot ignore it. I've said this before, it's like the Chinese refer to the people on Taiwan Island as their compatriots. They're literally family. The vast majority of people on Taiwan Island literally have family who still live on in Chinese mainland in Fujian. They speak the same language, same holidays, same everything. You go to Taiwan, it's simply, it's like Fujian province. It's an island version of Fujian province. But even as their compatriots, we have to understand that the strategic risk that Taiwan poses to China if it becomes a U.S. base, which it was in the past, until the mid 70s, it was a U.S. base. If that continues, that's a red line that China cannot tolerate. And that's why China will have to neutralize it. As I said, it's like a family member. You have a family member who's, going off into spiraling into their own thing. You will tolerate them. Okay, they lock themselves in their room. You will give them food and water. That you can handle. But if they start stockpiling guns and explosives and gasoline, how long before the family has to do something to, disarm them, right? That's the situation. Literally, Taiwan is that crazy, family member who is stockpiling weapons and gasoline and explosives, in your basement, and the family is concerned, and they're
Yes.
feeling the need to do something about it.
Let's go to South Korea. Yoon Suk Yeol. So apparently, there's supposed to be the Supreme Court is supposed to make a verdict on him today. Have they made that verdict yet, one way or the other, on whether or not they're going to allow the impeachment to go through?
So the verdict is due on Friday the 4th
I
at
thought it was today.
Yeah, not today, but
Okay.
we will know by tomorrow because Korea is ahead. It's already the future in Korea, literally and metaphorically. So the decision is going to be rendered on Friday, April 4th at 11 a.m. Korean time. This is
Okay.
123 days after the martial law declaration, over 4 months. And it's 112 days since his impeachment. Again, almost 4 months since he was impeached. The hearings on Yoon Suk-yeol's impeachment ended 1 month ago, and the Constitutional Court was sitting on the decision. They were not rendering a verdict. This is an open and shut case. There's no need to delay. Just think, did Yoon Suk-yeol declare martial law? Yes,
Yes.
he did. Everybody saw him on television. It was public knowledge. Okay. Did he break the law in declaring martial law? Yes, he did, because he had no justification for declaring martial law, and he used troops to prevent lawmakers from trying to, rescind the martial law. And we know from direct testimony that he told commanders who were at the National Assembly building to drag the lawmakers out, even if you have to shoot them. I mean,
Right.
this is on the record. It's an open and shut case. Is this unconstitutional? Does this constitute a military coup? It is an open and shut case. There's no need for them to deliberate for over a month on this. And yet they were hanging fire. They were
So
slow.
why do you think they're
Why?
slow on this?
It was two things. One is in March 26th, the key opposition leader, Lee Jae-myung, who almost beat Yoon Suk-yeol at the polls in the elections, 0.7, percent difference, and even that is suspect. But Lee Jae-myung is the opposition leader. He's facing multiple charges because Yoon has been trying to destroy him legally, and there was a case that was going to be adjudicated about whether he had, had some kind of procedural, whether there was some kind of procedural peccadillo during the process of his election. And if that appeal had been upheld by the appellate court, he would have gone to prison for at least a year, and he would have been stripped of political power for 10 years. That is, he would no longer be a viable presidential candidate. Remember, after impeachment, within 60 days, South Korea has to hold a new election for president. He would have been a shoo-in to become the U.S. He would have become a shoo-in to become the next president of South Korea, and he would have distanced himself from aggressive U.S. moves against China. So clearly, the U.S. didn't want him. Clearly, there was strong pressure exercised by the United States on South Korea's political process. We know this because, members of parliament have named, the U.S. ambassador as putting pressure on them. We know that Morse Tan, who was a former, he's a former ambassador at large. This is like a viceroy of the planet. He has said that the impeachment of Yoon is a Chinese plot. And that once if Yoon becomes president, the U.S. is completely effed, and they're no longer going to be able to have pressure over South Korea, and Yoon is going to be simply taking orders from Beijing. This is literally what he said. And so I think the first plan was to delay until March 26th, and then the second plan was to delay until April 18th. Now, April 18th is the date that two justices of the Constitutional Court have to retire.
Okay.
I'm sorry, three justices of the Constitutional Court have to retire, that they term out. The Constitutional Court has term limits in Korea, unlike the U.S. Supreme Court. I think it's a good idea, but they have to term out. And if they termed out, there would only be 5 justices left on the Constitutional Court, and that is not enough to make quorum. And so the entire impeachment procedure would have been abandoned because they could no longer render a judgment. So
they're doing any and everything in their power to effectively keep this guy or from issuing a verdict on the case, despite the fact that it is 1 + 1 is 2.
Exactly. There are 3 conservative justices on the court that are very, very pro-Yoon. And if they split the decision, there are currently 8 justices on the court. It should have 9, a full set of 9 justices. But Han Duck-soo refused to appoint the progressive one. That is already a violation of the Constitution, and he was impeached for that. But then the Constitutional Court, undid his impeachment. So now he is back in the presidency, and he still refuses to appoint the 9th justice because he's progressive. But there are 3 justices on the Constitutional Court that are conservative, right-wing, pro-Yoon. And if they split the decision so that we get a 5-3 decision or a 4-4 decision, anything less than 6 votes in favor of Yoon's impeachment means that Yoon walks free, and immediately he becomes president again. And if he becomes president again, all hell will break loose. And in particular, Yoon will declare martial law again. I guarantee you that's what will happen.
AJ, that is astonishing. Like, all of this is astonishing. Like, oh man, we're going to have to close it. But there is a breakdown of institutions across the world in a way that is disturbing, to put it mildly. Like, for example, Romania, where they locked up Carl Gogescu. Okay, well, he didn't want the war. He didn't want the military base. He didn't want to be involved in these kind of gamesmanship of NATO and everything else. And they're like, yeah, TikTok videos, we think it was pushed by the Russians. And come to find out, it wasn't pushed by the Russians at all. No, I don't know anybody who really believed that, but whatever. That's what they used in order to kill the election. He won the first round. He was about to win the second round when the court came in and literally killed the election. And then started throwing people in jail in order to prevent him from running. Le Pen in France, she most likely would have won in 2027. And, I don't know if Le Pen actually committed the crime that they say she committed, but it's pretty coincidental that what they end up with is a way of keeping her from running in the election, in and of itself. As
The
grotesque.
the French judges had the discretion to
Yes,
to stay her conviction until it was appealed, and that way she would still have had the possibility to run as a candidate. But
yep,
by arbitrarily imposing before she can appeal, they've essentially ended her political career, and that
yep.
does not sound like liberté, égalité, fraternité to me.
It does not. No, it does not. It's a bastardization of that process. In America, Donald Trump, I mean, they did everything, shot him, tried to put him in a cage. And the stuff they were trying to put him in a cage for were effectively things that Hillary Clinton herself did. I mean, the whole paying off a porn star and calling it a legal fee, it's not that much different than Hillary Clinton buying opposition research, calling it a legal fee. In Hillary Clinton's case, they gave her a slap on the wrist. In Trump's case, it was like, we need to put you in a cage. Like, this is taking place across the world. And then when you get to South Korea, you're getting something very similar, where regardless of whether you are hard right, hard left, 1+1 is 1, or 1+1 is 2. Like, any way you look at it. And you can look at the facts and say, okay, I may like him, but he's still guilty of sin for what he was effectively trying to do. But again, they blow it off. We don't have to do it. See no evil, hear no evil. Same thing here in the United States in regards to what they're doing, where they're like, yeah, we're going to give her the Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, but we're not going to say that we're doing it. We're just going to destroy it altogether by firing all of these people and making it a basket case. Or we're going to get rid of the Department of Education. Look, nobody voted for that. Even chucking people out the country without due process is outrageous. The judge and then argued, well, habeas corpus doesn't apply, even though we made a mistake. He can't file for appeal. Like, these are institutions that seem to be effectively just falling apart. ICC, I give you another one, International Criminal Court. They go after Putin for taking kids out of a war zone, and then you have to push and push and push for them to go after Netanyahu and Gallant, who are literally committing a genocide.
And then Duterte, remember Duterte, it was, arrested. He's going to be, sent to the ICC.
Yep.
And the Philippines doesn't even belong to the ICC.
So, there.
Right. The hypocrisy is over the charts. But what I see is happening, I think I agree with you absolutely. As the empire is unwinding and unraveling, it's becoming more and more desperate, and it's reverting to naked power. The gloves are off, no more, even pretense of doing things in, quote, a liberal, democratic fashion. It's just straight power concepts, as, George Kennan called it. And essentially, they're not even bothering to, put on the carnival mask anymore. We're just going to straight out do what we want, do what we need. And I think all those examples, including Korea, show that this is just simply, making empire is making its, violence, its last stand, and it's making it very, very violent. With Korea, there's still hope. Some people are still holding out hope that the Constitutional Court could do the right thing, because if they don't, it will be a civil war. It will be.
You really think it would get to that point where are people that committed to the cause? I mean, because here they're bowing their heads. Like when John Hopkins puts out the thing saying, hey, if ICE raids and comes to get Raul or whoever because they put a post on social media, just bow your heads. Don't try to help them. Don't try to do anything. Don't try to help them lead. And you're like, okay, so the institution effectively said just bow your heads. Same thing with Colombia. Like, it's not like you're getting this kind of aggressive pushback from institutions in areas where you think you would get it. They lay down. Do you think that you would get that level of, let's say, aggressive resistance against a court that obviously and clearly just humiliates itself by coming back with a bogus ruling?
I think that, just last week, 2 million people hit the streets. Okay, 2 million people. The KCTU, this Korean Confederation Trade Unions, probably the strongest, most powerful militant trade union in the world, they're out in the streets, and they're calling all their, members, to not only demonstrate, but there will be massive strikes if that happens. The Catholic Priests Association, the entire Catholic Church in Korea, is out on the streets. The
Wow.
Buddhists are out on the streets. The entire country is in an uproar. The country will come to a complete standstill if those justices do not impeach Yoon Suk-yeol, because they know that if they don't impeach Yoon Suk-yeol, they have just given him a license for continued martial law. They will not allow that. And the Koreans have always fought back. They fought back 1948, in 1960, 1972, 1979, 1980, 1987, and 2015. Each time the US puts in a quisling dictator, the Koreans fight back and overthrow them. And they're tired of that cycle. This takes us, for many Koreans, this is Groundhog Day. They're back in the same cycle that they were in 1979. And they went to the streets and shed blood to fight. And I believe that will happen again. So, let's everybody, pray for Korea, pray that those three conservative justices do the right thing and follow reason, logic, and standard jurisprudence, and that they uphold the impeachment. Because if they don't, all hell will break loose.
From your mouth to God's ears. KJ No, political analyst, journalist, writer, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia Pacific region. He's contributor to the book Capitalism on a Ventilator, once censored by Amazon. It is now available at iacenter.org. Also, KJ, where can people find you for your show?
The China Report on YouTube on the Breakthrough News Network.
Excellent. Thank you, my man. Always appreciate these conversations, KJ. Always learn something new. Thank you for this.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
You be safe.